This is my interview with Aaron Giles, recorded for my documentary The Making of Day of the Tentacle for this year's 30th anniversary. Aaron ported many LucasArts games to Mac, including Day of the Tentacle, and has worked for Microsoft. He was a major contributor to the arcade emulation software MAME for 17 years and headed the project for 6 of them. He's now developed Dream, a Windows-based emulator for playing Scum adventure games, and the 90s Star Wars games, which you can find on his website. There are links to Aaron's socials and website below, and links to the full playlist of interviews and the full documentary. As always, I've edited out some pleasantries at the start, so we'll jump right in. Enjoy! So I guess starting right at the start of, because obviously the video is going to be about Day of the Tentacle primarily, but I just wanted to know, what was your kind of background prior to LucasArts, and then how did you actually come to work for LucasArts? Do you remember the recruitment or interview process?
Yeah, well, so at the time, I was a big Mac guy in sort of the 1990s, pretty much throughout the 1990s, and around 92, LucasArts released Rebel Assault for the Mac, and that was right at the time that Apple was transitioning from 68040 to PowerPC based machines. So they went from Motorola 68,000 based machines to PowerPC. And as you know, since they've made this transition several times throughout their history, when they translate to a new architecture, they provide emulation support to run existing programs on the new architecture. And this was their first go at it, and they did a pretty good job. But it wasn't quite performant enough in that, your basic low-end PowerPC could almost keep up with a 68040 or a 68030, but not quite. And the place where it really hurt was in games. So when Rebel Assault came out, it was not written for PowerPC at all. It was only written for 68,000. And so what we found was that it ran kind of sluggishly. Those of us who ran on the PowerPC, it ran okay, but it was sluggish. It wasn't showing off our machines. So I decided, as a bit of a hacker, I would hack into the code and see if I could figure out a way to speed it up, because Apple provided a mechanism where you could insert PowerPC code even into older style code and have it kind of switch back and forth automatically. And so I figured out a place where they were drawing to the screen. I said, maybe I can just make this particular function a lot faster by writing it in native PowerPC code. And I hacked it in, and it worked. It made things run much better. So I put a patch up on the internet, and that caught the attention of LucasArts in a bad way and in a good way at the same time. So, of course, their legal department was like, hey, what's going on here? People are releasing hacks to our games. But on the other side, they said, well, this guy seems to know what he's doing. And also the programmer that they'd been using for all their Macintosh ports prior to, up and through Rebel Assault, he was interested in joining the company full time and moving on to new projects. Working on the Nintendo 64 ultimately is what he did. And so they were looking for somebody to replace him and become their Mac guy. So they said, well, this might work out. So they brought me in for an interview. I came out at the beginning of, or late in 1994 for an interview. Flew out to there because I was working in New York City at the time, and got the interview, got the job, and started right at the beginning of 1995 working at LucasArts on as being their Mac ports. And so they initially put me on, Dark Forces and Full Throttle, which were sort of the big up and coming games. And then I just powered through a whole bunch of ports in a bunch of years. And eventually they said, you've done your work here. The Mac isn't really that interesting to us. Apple's always been kind of wishy-washy with their game support. They were kind of on a high when I joined, and then they kind of petered out, as they usually do. And so they said, you need to go work on Windows games. And so then I joined the team to work on Outlaws, and eventually worked on Mysteries of the Sith, the Jedi Knight expansion pack. And then after that, I decided I was done with games and moved on to other things.
Mm-hmm. So were these, you doing Mac ports and stuff like that, was that like a precursor to your interest in emulation, or was that already, an interest of yours?
Yeah, so that was before I got into emulation. So, emulation was happening on the PowerPC, which was interesting to me as a concept, but I didn't really know how that all worked. Or a couple of years after I joined LucasArts, I discovered emulators, or actually a year or so after I joined LucasArts, I discovered emulators, and that really kind of lit a fire under me as something that was really exciting to me, especially as an arcade guy. To me, arcade was the pinnacle of what I wanted to play. Those always seemed to be the best versions of any games, and I was always disappointed with whatever home ports were done. They were never as good as what I wanted to do. And so the fact that I could run the real code of the arcade machines on my computer was exciting to me, and that's really what drew me into my emulation side.
So you were a big arcade fan as in your youth.
Yes, I mean I grew up right at the sweet spot of the time. I was I was born in 1970, so when 1980 hit, which is sort of the Pac-Man time frame, I was 10. That was perfect time. I would ride my bike to the nearest local drugstore, and they'd have a couple arcade machines in there, and you just drop quarters in them all the time. And the arcades were big; they were becoming pretty widespread. You could go to the arcade and play dozens of games, and that was exciting. And every time you went, there was something new, and it was pushing the technology forward and something kind of spectacular to see. And so that was really my driving force. I wanted to recreate all those old games on my system.
So, as you were saying, first projects were Dark Forces and Full Throttle for Lucas. So what were the major challenges with those first games, like porting them to Mac?
So on the Mac side, the expectation on the Mac is, at the time, Mac was all any color Macintosh were 640 by 480 resolution and higher. So our first challenge was that Mac users expected crisp, clean graphics, and of course, Dark Forces and Full Throttle were written for 320 by 200 VGA graphics. And in the past, all the Scum games, Eric Johnston, the guy who preceded me as the Mac porting guru, he developed something called EPX, which was a graphics smoothing algorithm. So it would take the pixels of the VGA screen, it would double them to a 4, every pixel became a little 2x2 pixel, but then he'd have intelligence for like filling in and creating diagonals and smoothing things out. And so all his Mac ports had an option to turn on the smoothing. In fact, I think the early ones didn't even have an option. I think it was just always on. And that gave the Mac users a slightly nicer looking display, though purists these days will be like, well, you should be looking at the original graphics and that kind of thing. But let's leave it up to the users at this point, I'd say. But so that solved the problem for the Scum games, and we applied that same EPX algorithm to Full Throttle and the Dig when I worked on those. So I just pretty much took his logic and updated it for the PowerPC and moved it there. But for Dark Forces, that was a new engine, and the Mac users were not going to stand for chunky VGA graphics unless you really needed to. So I actually went in and upgraded the engine myself with a little bit of help from Ray Gresco, who is the main engine developer for Dark Forces. He kind of helped me out in a few spots, but I mostly ended up just kind of trying to understand the engine enough to figure out how to double all the resolutions and get everything so that when it actually rendered the graphics, it was rendered at full 640, 480. And of course, that was pushing. The nice thing is we were writing strictly for the PowerPC. We didn't even bother doing 68040 version, as I recall. But for the PowerPC, it had enough horsepower to actually be able to do 640 by 480 graphics and run high resolution Dark Forces. And so that was a big win for the Mac at that time. And so that was one of the challenges. The big negative challenge was memory. DOS games at the time were targeting 8 megabytes, and the games would use them, but then we bring them to the Mac. And DOS, you don't really have an operating system, or you have a little tiny bit of an operating system that's a few hundred K. On the Mac, you had an operating system that took 2-3 megs of your 8 megs. And so we had to figure out how to cram a game that had the expansiveness of almost the full 8 megs on DOS to shrink it down and get it to actually run in 4.5 megs or 5 megs of memory. And so that was really the big challenge. It wasn't too bad for Full Throttle, but for Dark Forces, we experimented with a lot of things like reducing texture resolution and other kind of things. I can't even remember what we eventually settled on. But in addition to running at higher resolution, we had to compress everything down a bit to get it to go.
So obviously, Full Throttle uses Scum and the Insane engine.
Correct.
So once you'd kind of done that, did that make future ports kind of easier after you'd laid the groundwork?
Yeah. Insane was a good thing. So what happened normally was prior to Insane existing, all the Scum games, wrote directly to the hardware themselves. But when they did Full Throttle, they had to integrate Scum with the cutscenes and with the interactive parts of the engine. And so in order to make that happen, Scum was sort of retargeted to not talk directly to the hardware, but instead to work. Insane had its own abstractions to talk to the hardware. They had its own video systems and own sound systems. And what they did was they took Scum and said, Scum's not going to talk directly to the hardware. Scum will just talk to Insane's version of the things that talk to the hardware. And so it kind of redirected all the video accesses and all the input and all the sound stuff through Insane. And so Insane was sort of like the thing that talked to the hardware. And so that kind of made it easier for me, because then I just had to port the Insane part of things, and the Scum stuff just kind of worked because it already talked to the hardware through Insane. So it already had that connection to the hardware there. And so that made it easier. And then when we did the dig, Insane really didn't change much between Full Throttle and the dig. So we were able to pretty much, that was like a super easy slam dunk port. You could, just bring the code over and recompile it, and it pretty much worked right out the gate.
So with Day of the Tentacle and Sam and Max, is it true that you kind of did those of your own volition? And if so, how did that come about? Yeah,
so when I did Full Throttle, and seeing how easy the dig was to get going once I'd done the Full Throttle work, I was like, well, it bothered me that we had a gap in our things, because when there was a transition from Eric Johnston to me, Lucas had kind of dropped the adventure games in favor of focusing on getting things like Rebel Assault going, because they thought Star Wars was going to be the big seller, and I'm sure it was. But Sam and Max and Day of the Tentacle never got Mac releases under Eric, and when I joined, the management was interested in moving forward and not looking backwards at things that have been done. So there was this gap there, and I said, well, those games look pretty neat. I wonder how hard it would be to do it. And so what I did was I actually took them and basically I got source code of them from the developers, and I pretty much did what we did for Full Throttle, whereas I took all the video routines, and rather than having to port them to the Mac, I said, well, let's just port them to talk to Insane. Even though they don't use cutscenes, even though they don't use any of the Insane, libraries for anything that's important, it can still use the video and audio hardware and input stuff. And once I did that, then it would be super easy to just bring them over on top of the same system that I already ported to the Mac. And so I did that, and literally it took me, maybe a week each to get each of them up and running. And, I said, well, this was so easy. Surely you can figure out some way to ship these. And marketing at first was thinking, well, we weren't planning on it, but they scrambled, and they came back eventually with an idea and a plan for how to do it and where to fit it into the schedule. And so they both got formal releases, which made me super happy, and actually introduced me to Day of the Tentacle, which looked like a neat game. And then I finally got a chance to play through it, debugging it and figuring it out, and it turned into probably my favorite Scum game. So
yeah, one of my favorites as well, for sure. So how much do you actually have to understand about the original code when you do something like that?
Actually, very little. So it's kind of funny. There's the two things that I enjoy doing a lot are emulation, as I mentioned before, and porting, which is taking something that already exists on one platform and converting it to the other. And in both cases, the goal is to not really have to understand the code, what the code's doing so much, but to provide a platform that the code can run on, or an environment that the code can run in. And so, and it helped that Scum, which was the majority of the Lucas games leading up to when I joined, Scum was already written for multiple platforms. And so the places where you needed to talk to the video hardware, which was very specific to each platform, or to the sound hardware, or to the inputs, those were already kind of isolated because they knew that that chunk would have to be rewritten for every platform, but they didn't want to have to touch the rest of the engine in order to bring it to a new platform. And so Scum was already well organized that way. And Insane was also written that way to begin with, because they were going to target the Mac out the gate. And so anytime you write with the idea that you might want to bring it to a new platform, you'll hopefully organize your code in a way that anything that's going to talk to the platform specific stuff is highly isolated and easy to just swap out with something else that's maybe targeting a new platform. And so when that happens and when the code's well written, I don't really have to know how the engine works. And so, a lot of times people will come up to me, hey, you worked on those Scum games. Can you tell me how actors work and how shores work and the tools work? I have no idea how any of that stuff works. I have a vague idea. I'm not stupid, but at the same time, I hadn't delved into the details because I didn't need to. Dark Forces was one of the few cases where I did have to dive into the details a bit because we were increasing the engine resolution. I actually had to get my hands dirty in that. But going forward from that, that was the only game where we really did any significant enhancements. Every game that I worked on after that for the Mac was really just as is, the DOS version ported to the Mac, maybe with the graphic smoothing thing, the EPX added on top of that, but that was very easy to do as a post-processing step at the very end when you were copying the data to the screen, and so therefore it didn't really interfere with the rest of the engine at all.
So in Day of the Tentacle, there's that bit where you can play Maniac Mansion, but I think it literally just is running Maniac Mansion.
Mm-hmm.
So did you have to also do Maniac Mansion when you did?
Absolutely. I actually did that. So you're right. On the DOS version, all it does is it shells out and runs the real Maniac Mansion and then returns back. But on the Mac, we couldn't really launch a new program because that would present a weird thing to the user. So eventually what I did was I took the Maniac Mansion source code, which we dug out of the archives. I ported that to run on top of Insane as well. So that I also had, I took all the video abstraction targeted toward Insane, which turned out to be an interesting thing to do for future projects. But and then I converted that code to basically a library that I could link into Day of the Tentacle. And so when you run it on the Mac, it's not launching a new program. It's just basically calling another function that's talking to the same Insane engine that the Day of the Tentacle is talking to, and knows that for its hardware. And then when it exits, it just returns back to Day of the Tentacle. And so it actually worked pretty nicely the way it was set up.
Interesting.
So the Mac had never had never had Maniac Mansion nor Zach McCracken. That's the one game that never actually touched the Mac was Zach McCracken. I don't think they ever got a Mac port of that.
Oh wow!
But all the other ones made it, except for Curse as well. And Curse of Monkey Island didn't make it to the Mac either. I don't think. Maybe it did. I wasn't involved. That was after my time.
Oh, okay. So it says, I think on your site, which I will link to, obviously, for anyone watching. You say you did, I think, 9 Mac ports your first year at LucasArts.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's churning them out, isn't it?
It is, but like I said, once you've got the basic engine done, the Scum games were easy to do. So that was 4 of them, was Full Throttle to the Dig, and then the Day of the Tentacle and Santa Max. And then Insane ran, in Full Throttle, but then it also ran Rebel Assault 2, so that was pretty much free. And we did Mortimer, which is a fairly obscure kids game that was done, and that was also on the Rebel Assault engine and the Insane engine, so that was another freebie. So basically, I really just ported a couple engines, Dark Forces, Scum, Insane, really just Insane, and then the only one that was really an outlier was the Desktop Adventures, the Indiana Jones and his Desktop Adventures, which was completely written strictly for Windows, used the Microsoft Foundation classes, which was very Microsoft specific, and porting that to the Mac was really a labor of love. I just really wanted to do it, but I really had to hack up the code pretty severely to make that work. And we were doing well too, because future games, we had plans on the Mac to do, like I had a Mac port of Outlaws, which never released. I had a Mac port of Shadows of the Empire working, which never released. They weren't polished to the point of release, but they were far enough along that I could play those games. And even Jedi Knight, I had Jedi Knight running as well on the Mac. But at that time, management had decided that the Mac ports just weren't doing well enough, and we weren't getting the support we wanted from Apple on that part. And so we just decided to move on and focus on Windows. So that's when I became a Windows programmer.
So did you say your first thing on Windows was Outlaws?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I worked on like the weapon systems and integrating the cutscenes, and I ported Insane to Windows. So that was sort of my porting experience. We took Insane and ported to Windows to run these cutscenes and Outlaws, which were quite extensive. They were way longer than any of the other cutscenes we had done. And in fact, that presented some problems because the audio video sync would gradually get out of sync, and you wouldn't notice it over the course of like 20 seconds, but over the course of a 10-minute cutscene, the opening cutscene Outlaws is literally 10 minutes long. And at the end, there's this scene where the marshal takes a shovel and jams it into the dirt, and it's got this very crisp thing. And if that thing's out of sync, at the very end, you're kind of like, well, yeah, you blew it. And so I had to do a lot of work getting the windows to sync up just right across all that. So that was sort of my thing for Outlaws, and I worked on the weapon system and the networking system so that we could get 16-player simultaneous games, which was like our first networked game. So it was kind of exciting to work on early networking stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. Was that quite a leap in terms of the programming and what have you from doing what you were doing for them?
It certainly was different. I mean, I was actually working on the engine for a change, which ultimately is what I wanted to do, I thought. So it was a good opportunity for me, and it was a little hard because I was learning Windows for the first time, and so that required a lot of work. And we were at a time right then when DirectX was new, so DirectX 3 was what we were working toward, as I recall, and it was pretty flaky. It was so flaky, in fact, that for Outlaws, every DirectX component we used, we had a backup. So we had DirectX, but we also had like a driver that could use SciTech Display Doctor. We had, direct sound, but we also had a backup that could use the wave functions in Windows. And there's a whole configuration program you could use to select which ones to load, and they all had an interface so that we could you could run Outlaws entirely without DirectX at all, because we were that nervous about the support for it and how widespread it worked and everything like that. So eventually that settled down, but in the early days, it was definitely a little dicey.
So then, I mean, it was maybe a few years on in the, I think it was the early 2000s. They obviously re-released all the old Scum games and what have you on Windows, didn't they? The CD re-releases.
They did some of them, and mostly in Europe, so you guys got the benefit of it. But and then they did a Steam releases eventually as well of some of the games. So yeah, basically, because I had done all those ports to the Mac, I had the idea in the early 2000s, saying that the DOS versions were getting harder and harder to run on Windows reliably with Windows XP and all the new NT-based systems. And so I said to LucasArts, even though I was working for Microsoft at the time, or was I working for Connect? I was working for Connectix at the time. I emailed some of my old folks at LucasArts, and I said, hey, if you sent me the sources, I bet you I could make Windows versions of these, no problem. And it'd basically be like porting to the Mac, except it just port to Windows. And how hard could that be? And eventually I convinced them. They weren't quite sure whether they really wanted to do it, but I eventually convinced them to at least give me the sources and let me see what I can produce, and you can decide what you want to do with them. And so I did that, and I eventually just took all the sources for all the Scum games up through then, which was everything up through the Dig, and I converted them all to compile with modern compilers and to talk to the Insane engine as their common denominator, so that we had one thing that you had to port. And the patterns were pretty obvious, even though I was dealing with multiple engines from Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken, all the way through the early Indiana Jones games and so I did that. I ported them all, and I pretty much had really nice simple Windows versions. They were very stripped down and minimal. You just double clicked on it. You could take the executable that I provided, put it right next to all the files that they shipped previously. You could just ship that additional executable and have a Windows version that ran on modern systems and didn't have any issues. And so initially they wanted to do a full throttle version that was released online, which at the time, this was in 2003, the idea of shipping a multi-100 megabyte game to people over the internet was kind of crazy. And so I worked on all kinds of like audio compression things to try and get the size of the files down so that it wasn't even a CD. They wanted to get it down to under 100 megs. We never quite got there. I think I got it to about 150, and I actually don't remember even what shipped or what. They were working with some partner to provide a thing where you like downloaded like the basic part of the game and then it streamed to the rest of it as you kind of went along. I don't even know if that saw the light of day, but that was sort of the idea, to kind of make it more palatable. So that effort paid off. And then, I had all these versions and I gave it to them, and that was the end of my contract because I got them to pay me for them, but it was sort of a minimal contract thing, and I was done. And I never knew what happened to them. I eventually found out that some folks in Europe, some of the European licensees got a hold of the executables and shipped them. So, Day of the Tentacle, I think ultimately my versions of Day of the Tentacle, Sam Max, Full Throttle, The Dig, Indie Fate, and Loom and Indie and the Last Crusade, all those eventually made it out in at least one country, but it's not very consistent. I mean, I had working on my current emulation project Dream, which is basically inventorying all the LucasArts game that I discovered which ones finally actually made it out into the world. And it's been kind of interesting, the random hodgepodge that is. But and then they took some of the games and made Steam releases. So like the early Steam releases of like Indie Crusade, Indie Fates, Loom, and I think The Dig were all based on my versions. And then they actually had a little bit extra QA that was done to them, and so by the people who were there. So they weren't exactly my versions, but they were pretty much my versions that were shipped out there. And then I know that they did I don't know if the Monkey special releases used any of my versions or not underneath them, but it's possible that they at least were able to benefit from the work that I did to kind of abstract that out. But who knows? I don't have no idea what went on in those, and I don't know about any of the re-releases either. I think those were all separate ports. So
yeah, I think I think at least some of them were quite common over here.
yeah,
I've definitely got a few of them. That I know they did a Sam Max Day of the Tentacle like double pack thing, and they did Monkey Island 1 and 2 together as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I don't know that my Monkey 1 and 2s ever made it out. The executables for those ever made it out, the Windows versions. But if you find them, let me know. I'd love to see them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I do have a CD here, but I don't know how I would tell if they are yours or not.
Yeah.
I'll have to send you a copy, and you can decipher it for yourself.
Yeah.
So were you involved in the special editions? You don't know if it was. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't directly involved.
No.
I just speculate that the timing of it seems likely that they at least had my code. I don't know if they used my versions, but I mean, it was mostly the original code, just updated and converted to compile on modern systems and have that abstraction layer ported to Insane. So maybe they use that, maybe not.
Yeah. So at what point did you get into contributing to MAME then?
So I in '97 I had discovered MAME through MAME, which was a port done by Brad Oliver. And I was excited to help him out on doing Mac specific stuff because that was sort of my wheelhouse. But I also wanted to figure out how this whole emulation thing worked. And so I spent a lot of time just digging into the code and figuring it out. But I mean, ultimately, what motivated me was the lack of support for the game that I really wanted to see on there, which was Mappy, which was a Namco game that was primarily popular in Japan, but for whatever reason, the local 7-Eleven in my area had one, and it became my favorite game pretty quickly. And so I didn't know what was involved at all in emulation at that time, apart from understanding what the concept was. And so I just kind of was watching what people were doing, watching what changes were going in, and eventually somebody added Super Pac-Man, which turns out to be hardware very similar to Mappy. And once I had understood the connection between those two, I'm like, well, maybe I can just hack up this Super Pac-Man thing and make it run Mappy. And so that's essentially how I got my foot wet in the emulation side of things there. But after that, once I got the idea of how it worked, I just wanted to keep adding more and more because there were, dozens and dozens of games I could think of that I wanted to see running. And there were also dozens of games that I'd never heard of before that I was curious to see what they were about. Because I had no idea the depth of the number of games that were available. You only get to see what's in your local area and what you experienced, and you realize there's a world out there that's 10 times bigger.
Yeah, I mean, there's as well. There's such vastly different hardware. It must be a whole different challenge getting games to run because you might have one up sort of arcade system that's miles away from another. So is that is that difficult? I mean, do you ever come up to hurdles that you just can't surpass with arcade stuff?
Oh, for sure. A lot of it depends on, in the early days, we didn't really have access to the hardware so much because we weren't arcade operators. And we pretty much relied on the arcade operators as a collective had sort of created these archives where they had read the ROM chips off their games as a backup and done that, because a lot of times the chips would fail, and so to fix them, they'd just reprogram a new one and put it on their thing, and that was an easy fix. And so once they realized that they could do that, they created these archives, and we were pretty much looking at those archives that had been made available, and we didn't know anything about the hardware. We just knew, oh, this is Galaga. Okay, I don't know what's in Galaga. I don't know what hardware Galaga uses, but I have a bunch of ROM chips and it dumps, so I can maybe figure it out. And so at that point, you would take, each ROM chip and run it through. Well, is it a Z80? Well, let's dump the code as Z80 code, and if it looks like reasonable code, then it's probably a Z80. Or if it's not, doesn't look like reasonable code, then we'll take the same code and dump it as a 6502 and say, well, is that a 6502 based game or whatever? And so eventually, once kind of know what hardware that was available at the time and what was common, you could start to deduce just from these ROM dumps that people had done what the hardware was. But even so, you didn't really know how the video worked. But a lot of that was just pattern matching. I mean, once you saw how one game worked, the games tended to work in similar ways. There wasn't, every once in a while you'd come up with something that did something really novel, but the patterns were pretty much there. Most games had, we call them tile maps in MAME. They basically are grids of 8x8 characters, and the 8x8 characters it's like a text mode on a PC, but instead of characters being letters, they're various shapes, and how the colors worked was pretty common between the different systems. And so, they might be, you would have to deduce them and figure them out, but you kind of had a lot of patterns to look up against and say, well, does it work like this, or does it work like this? How do sprites work? How do, backgrounds work? And so eventually you just kind of got a feel for it, and you'd be able to make, the more experience you had with it, the greater the leaps in deduction that you could do, and the more quickly you could deduce what was happening. And so that was the early, first probably 5-6 years. Eventually we got, interest from people who actually did work in arcades, because they were seeing the benefit of having this big library of things and knowing how these games worked. And so we'd have people who would have access to boards, and also a lot of us started buying. You could go to eBay and buy a Pac-Man board, just the raw board that you'd put in a cabinet normally, but those of us who were there would study the board. We'd say, okay, well, I can see exactly how many RAM chips there are here, and what CPU it is, and exactly what clocks are on the thing and how they're connected up, so I can get that all there. And so eventually it became a lot more hardware focused. And these days, anything arcade related is a lot more hardware focused. And the folks doing the FPGA emulation, they're taking it to another level where they're kind of starting from scratch. They don't have a body of emulation work, so they're building up new emulators, basically written in VHDL or whatever they're using for the FPGA. But they're kind of going back to the hardware level and figuring it out at the hardware level, which is something that we didn't start doing. We kind of went back and did that for a bunch of games. And the FPGA guys are kind of, since they're starting over, they're doing that from the beginning, which is the right way to do it. I think a lot of us would have, in retrospect, would have preferred to do it that way with the level of understanding that we have now. So, I think in the end, they're getting the benefit of what we've done in the past, is sort of like, how do things basically sort out, but they're able to kind of go back to the hardware now and really study it in a way that we weren't able to.
So obviously you established that your era was kind of 1980-ish. Mm-hmm. What was the kind of latest games that you would work on?
Well, that's the thing, is like, as I got into emulation, I would work on games way later than games I ever played in the arcades. So, certainly I probably stopped, my direct arcade experience probably stopped in like 86, 87, as I got to be a late teenager and more focused on programming in school and getting into college and stuff like that. And so, games like Marble Madness and Road Blasters, some of the 16-bit games, like that were more sort of where my experience ended. And then but in terms of emulation, I was curious to see how things progressed after I played, and so I ended up emulating crazier and crazier hard things that I never expected that we'd be able to emulate in MAME. When I first started, we eventually started doing it. We emulated. When MAME started, it was all 8-bit CPUs, and then somebody finally added a 68,000, so we had a 16-bit CPU. That was pretty exciting. But we added 32-bit CPUs eventually. I eventually, the thing that I got to do a lot in MAME, which I feel pretty excited about, is that I got to sort of push the boundaries. So, we had never emulated games that booted off a hard disk before. Most games ran off of ROM, but Atari and Midway eventually wrote games that booted off hard disks, and so we had to add the concept of an IDE controller and a hard disk and emulate that. And how do you store the data that's written back to the hard disk? And ROMs, they were read-only. The hard disks are not read-only, so how do you handle that? So I had to develop a whole format for that, and then 3D games was something I never thought we'd be able to do, but we ended up doing it anyway. And so I wrote a whole 3DFX Voodoo emulator that ended up being the basis for a lot of stuff. Even DOSBox, early DOSBox was using my derivative of my code. I don't know where it's at these days, if they're still using anything that's related to what I did, but so that became kind of an interesting thing. And we even support 64-bit processors, because like some of the games use like 64-bit MIPS processors and that kind of thing. So extending MAME, pushing its boundaries, was just sort of something that was part and parcel of what we were doing there. And since I actually ran the project for a good chunk, I ran the project for 5-6 years in there. Those were times when I really got to feel free to just push the project in whatever direction we needed to do in order to support the things we wanted to do. So, it was really interesting to see the progression from these ROM-based games, these 8-bit ROM-based games, to 16, 32-bit games that ran on hard disks and CDs and that use 3D graphics and crazy frame buffer mixings and stuff like that. And so that was an interesting progression to be a part of, and to kind of witness through reverse engineering, basically.
Are you still involved with that side of things?
Not so much. So I took a break from MAME when my son was born. Didn't really have the time, and kind of set it aside and pursued things like music and other things that were sort of my other main hobby. But I went back to it for a couple of years, for a year or so, a little while ago. Did some emulation of analog sound circuits, which was very interesting. So like the old Cinematronics games, to add emulated sound for them, and some of the early Sega games. But eventually I decided that it was time to move on and work on other things. And so my goal long term had been to at work was to get to a point where I could, freelance rather than work for a big corporation. And so about a year ago, I took that plunge and left my job at Microsoft, my cushy corporate job at Microsoft, which I'd had for 18 years. And I went off and did kind of freelance things so I could work on projects that I was interested in. So in that kind of environment, I decided that working on emulators on my own was an interesting thing. So I kind of wanted to pursue some ideas that I'd had to play with.
So I guess that just leads me to the last question I had, which is just, where can people follow you, and do you want to plug anything for anyone watching where we can follow what you're up to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my website is the best place to follow me, or Mastodon. I'm on, Aaron S. Giles at corteximplant.com. I still have a Twitter account, but I'm kind of down on Twitter at the moment, as many people are. My latest project is Dream, which is an emulator that's focused specifically on LucasArts games. So it's basically it sort of rides the edge between DOSBox and ScumVM, and that it can run all the Scum games, including the later 3D games like Grim Fandango and Escape from Monkey Island, the latest version, which I'm just about to get out of beta. So hopefully by the time this is public, it'll be out of beta for 2.0, and it runs on Windows and Mac systems, and it'll let you run those, but it'll also run some of the era of games that I'm familiar with as well, outside of the Scum games. Like it'll run Dark Forces, it'll run the Rebel Assault games, and X-Wing and TIE Fighter, the flight sim games, and it'll also run Afterlife, which is a forgotten LucasArts sim game where you simulate heaven and hell. It's like Sim City, but you're controlling heaven and hell, sort of a tongue-in-cheek take on the simulation genre. So I don't know where it's going in the future. It's kind of a generic emulator at this point, but I really want to focus it on providing a good experience for the few games it does, rather than being a broad emulator like DOSBox, where you have to tweak it and configure it for each game and that kind of thing. I like to kind of make it a little more bespoke for that. So right now it's very LucasArts focused. It may stay that way. I have other ideas for LucasArts games. I kind of would like to see Outlaws running on it just because that's another game I worked on. It'd be kind of neat to emulate myself. But I'm also kind of curious to see some of the earlier flight sims run on it too, like Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe and all the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games that would run there. So I don't know where I'll take it eventually, but follow me to see where it goes. It's an interesting project, and it's a good way to run your old Lucas games on modern Windows and Mac systems.
Sounds brilliant. I'm sure many people watching will be interested in that, and we'll leave links down below and everything. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it so much. And yeah, I'll send you some links when it's all eventually goes up, which hopefully is June for the 30th anniversary in June. So
okay, yeah, I hadn't been tracking that. Wow, it's a long time.
Yeah, time flies. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So are you doing a full documentary, or?
Yeah, I call it a documentary, but I mean it's just me, like sort of hobby-ish thing. But I did one for Monkey Island for the 30th anniversary a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay, I'll have to go look that up.
Yeah, I mean, I can send you a link to that.
Yeah, send me a link to that too.
Yeah, yeah, it's just fun, and yeah, documenting the making of some of these games that are just timelessly good games.
Yeah, they really are. So, but yeah, it's pretty exciting times, and lots of interest in the game still, which is great. The re-releases that have been done recently and stuff, and that's great.
Yeah, really good to see.
Yeah. So okay, well, yeah, just send me some links and let me know what the status of things is, and if you have any follow-ups, I'm happy to answer them by email or whatever.
Thank you very much. Okay, speak soon. I'll let you get on with your day. Cheers.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Ciao.